Well, sometimes, sometimes things don't go as planned. So you mean to tell me you're gonna hold that against me because I love you and I want this moment to be special?
This is not love. This is hate. You know I'm cold. Nature.
Oh, and you think I hate you?
Whoa, stop recording me.
I'm not recording you, girl. Oh, finally. Go then. Go then.
What does it take for a woman to finally walk away from a man who has shown her, in the clearest way possible, that he is capable of ending her life? On the night of December 11th, 2023, in the small town of Hoffman, North Carolina, a violent encounter unfolded inside the modest home on McCoy Drive. It was a night where survival collided with loyalty, where the face of violence broke through the mask of love. This is the story of Kenisha Miranda Harrison Neely, 37 years old mother of three, who paid a $3,000 bond to free her husband after he was charged with assaulting and kidnapping her, only for him to kill her months later. The call for help came just before midnight. Richmond County deputies raced to the address for what was reported as a domestic disturbance. When they arrived, the scene was tense and chaotic. Kenisha, then 37 years old, was visibly shaken. She told deputies that her husband, Sheldon Moses Neely, had attacked her. He had struck her during an argument and forced her into the bedroom, locking her inside. Somehow, she managed to retrieve a handgun. In the struggle that followed, she pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Moses in the thigh. When deputies forced their way inside, they found him bleeding but alive. He was handcuffed and escorted away from the home, his blood marking the floorboards of the bedroom where Kenisha had fought to protect herself. He was charged with second-degree kidnapping, assault on a female, interfering with emergency communications. These were not minor offenses. They carried the weight of a man whose violence had escalated to a life-threatening level. Moses was initially held without bond due to the domestic violence nature of his crime, a measure meant to protect Kenisha and her children from the possibility of his immediate return. Yet what happened next defied logic and left a haunting mystery in its place. Within days of that December night, Kenisha posted a $3,000 bond for his release, and she brought him back home. Welcome to True Crime Red Flag. Thank you to my amazing subscribers. May your family stay safe wherever you are. If you're new here, subscribe and like this video because we reveal the warning signs that so many people ignore until it's too late. How could a woman who had fought for her life with a gun turn around and unlock the very cage that held her abuser? Why would she invite him back into the house where she and her daughters had just survived a night of terror? The answer is not simple, and it cannot be reduced to the false assumption that she chose love over safety. The truth lives in the psychology of abuse, in the way manipulation corrodes judgment, in the way a person like Moses could twist loyalty into chains stronger than steel. Imagine the house after the deputies left that night, the quiet returning to fill the rooms, the bedroom door bearing marks from the struggle, the weight of what had happened hanging in the air. In that house, Kenisha had held the gun, her mind caught between relief and devastation. She had survived, but she had also crossed a line, firing on the man she believed she was supposed to stand by. When the shock wore off, guilt crept in. This was not just a homecoming. It was the quiet rewriting of a story that had nearly ended differently. What should have been the beginning of Kenisha's escape became the beginning of her countdown. From that day on, every argument, every silent glare, every moment of tension was a step closer to tragedy. To ask why didn't she just leave is to misunderstand what it means to live under the control of someone like Moses. Victims of domestic violence don't simply weigh love against pain. They are caught in a cycle where guilt becomes as binding as fear, where leaving feels more dangerous than staying, and where society itself sometimes reinforces the idea that loyalty requires endurance. Kenisha wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She was a woman entangled in years of manipulation by a man who had honed control like a weapon. Her choice to post his bond wasn't an act of devotion. It was the distorted outcome of constant psychological warfare, where her sense of responsibility had been twisted until she blamed herself for his violence. By paying his bond, she wasn't protecting him from the system. She was punishing herself, convincing herself that she had crossed a line by pulling that trigger. But that decision, that single transaction at the bondsman's office, did more than free him. It unlocked the final chapter of her life. It placed her daughters back into the same house with a man who had already proven himself capable of brutality. It gave him another chance to rewrite the story his way, and to make sure that if she ever thought of leaving, she would never live to follow through. December 11th, 2023, should have been the night that saved her. Instead, it became the night that sealed her fate. It revealed the man Moses really was, and it revealed the dangerous hold he had over Kenisha's heart and mind. The warnings weren't subtle, they were blaring, and yet the bond was posted. The door was opened, and the tragedy that would claim her life less than 8 months later was set into motion. To understand why Kenisha made that baffling choice, we have to go back. We have to return to 2019, when a message sent from inside a prison cell began a romance that looked like salvation on the surface, but was always a trap of manipulations. What makes a successful woman with her own home, her own career, and 3 daughters to care for fall in love with a man sitting inside a prison cell? To understand the tragedy that unfolded in Hoffman, North Carolina, we cannot begin with the night of violence in 2023. We must go back to the beginning, to the life Kenisha had built before Moses, and to the moment his voice first slipped into her world. Kenisha Miranda Harrison was born on March 25, 1986, in Memphis, Tennessee, and raised in the Binghamton neighborhood. She grew into a young woman defined by persistence and ambition. Friends remember her as someone who was always striving for more, determined to balance motherhood with career and education. She pursued her studies, eventually earning a degree in business administration. She became a certified nursing assistant, working with patients who relied on her care, while also earning her license as a bail bondsman, a profession that reflected both her independence and her willingness to stand inside difficult spaces others might fear. By her late 30s, Kenisha was a homeowner, a single mother raising 2 daughters, and the kind of woman others saw as resilient, capable, and resourceful. But independence doesn't shield anyone from loneliness. Beneath the accomplishments and the steady rhythm of her work, Kenisha longed for connection. She wanted the kind of love story that could withstand time, the kind that would give her daughters a father figure and herself the feeling of being cherished. It was this longing that opened the door to Moses. In late 2019, as she scrolled through Facebook, a message arrived from a man she didn't know well. His name was Sheldon Moses Neely, and he was writing from prison. On the surface, his words carried warmth, humor, and persistence. What she didn't see, what most wouldn't have seen unless they looked deeper, was his history. Moses was 46 years old when he first reached out. His criminal record stretched back to the mid-1990s, a long chain of arrests and convictions. He had damaged property, resisted arrest, assaulted others, and by 2010 had been convicted of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injury, a charge that earned him a 12-year prison sentence. He was a man whose life was defined by violence and control. Yet behind the bars, Moses learned another skill: manipulation. He knew how to present himself as attentive, romantic, and deeply invested. For Kenisha, the messages turned into calls. The calls turned into what they called FaceTime dates, virtual connections where Moses poured out affection, compliments, and promises. From behind prison walls, he built an image of himself as loyal, devoted, and transformed by love. This tactic, known as love bombing, was deliberate. Moses flooded Kenisha with attention at a time when she was balancing work, motherhood, and the search for stability. He told her she was special, that she was the only woman who had truly understood him, that he had been waiting for someone exactly like her. He proposed not once, but twice, each time layering his words with urgency and devotion. He promised her that when he walked free, they would build a life together that others could only envy. By December 17, 2021, the fantasy became permanent. Kenisha walked into a prison facility and married Moses. Photographs from that day showed her smiling, radiant, convinced that she had found love in the most unlikely place. To her, the prison wedding wasn't a red flag. It was a symbol of loyalty, proof to the world that she believed in second chances, that she was strong enough to stand beside the man others judged too harshly. On social media, she doubled down on that narrative, posting about her devotion to him, framing her commitment as a triumph over skepticism. She defended him against the doubts of friends and family, insisting that their love was real. The performance of loyalty became part of the relationship itself. Whenever questions were raised about his past, Kenisha dismissed them. Whenever concerns were voiced about what would happen once he was released, she framed those concerns as negativity. She had invested too much, too publicly, to admit that she might have been misled. From Moses's perspective, the arrangement was perfect. Behind bars, he didn't have to face the daily responsibilities of family life or work. He could curate himself as the man she wanted him to be. He could send carefully crafted words, receive visits where time was structured and short, and never be confronted with the everyday frictions that real cohabitation brings. In this way, the relationship thrived inside its artificial boundaries. But prison romances are often built on fantasy, and fantasy collapses when it collides with freedom. What Kenisha saw as devotion, others could already identify as manipulation. Moses's words were never about building her up. They were about binding her closer. His love bombing wasn't generosity. It was control disguised as affection. And each step deeper into that relationship pulled her further away from the instincts and supports that might have protected her. To those outside the relationship, the signs were clear. A man with a violent past, a woman willing to align her life with his despite everything that history suggested. But inside the relationship, the story looked different. Kenisha convinced herself she was rewriting his ending, that she was the one who could anchor him, stabilize him, transform him. This is one of the most dangerous illusions of all, the belief that love alone can conquer violence. By the time Moses was released from prison on September 12, 2022, Kenisha's loyalty to him had become part of her identity. She had built her public persona around being the woman who stood by her man. She had made herself the proof of his redemption. His release was not just the end of his prison sentence. It was the beginning of a new phase of her life, one where she expected her investment to pay off. But as we will see, the gap between fantasy and reality was wide. The story of Kenisha's origin with Moses isn't just about a relationship that began in prison. It's about the construction of an illusion that would bind her tighter than any cell bars. It's about the way a violent man used charm and persistence to turn a strong, independent woman into the guardian of his second chance. And it's about the way she, like so many others, mistook enablement for loyalty. The marriage in 2021 was celebrated as a victory for love, but in truth, it marked the beginning of her undoing. When Moses walked out of prison in 2022, the man who stepped into her home was not the carefully curated version she had come to know through screens and calls. He was the man his record had always said he was: controlling, volatile, incapable of change. To understand how quickly the fantasy collapsed, we must step into the period after Moses' release. The neighborhood disturbances, the arguments, the pregnancies that strained their lives, and the gradual unraveling of the perfect love story she had once defended. When Moses Neely walked out of prison on September 12, 2022, it was supposed to mark the beginning of a redemptive chapter. Kenisha had built the story of their love around this moment. For nearly 3 years, she had been his confidant, his anchor, his voice on the outside. She had defended their relationship when others questioned it, insisting that her loyalty would be rewarded when he returned to her in freedom. The man who entered her home was not the same man she had known through carefully staged video calls and curated conversations from behind bars. Prison had stripped Moses of many choices, but it had also insulated him. Behind those walls, he could play the part of the attentive partner, shielded from the stresses and responsibilities of real life. On the outside, the facade collapsed almost immediately. Neighbors in Hoffman began noticing disturbances at the McCoy Drive home. Arguments spilled out into the yard. Raised voices carried through the air, interrupting the quiet of the neighborhood. What Kenisha had painted on social media as a love story, proof of her resilience and faith, was in truth beginning to fray. Freedom didn't redeem Moses. It magnified his volatility. The lack of structure, the inability to adapt, the long-buried patterns of control and anger, all of it resurfaced within weeks. Instead of gratitude for the woman who had waited for him, he grew restless, frustrated, quick to lash out. For Kenisha, the dream she had invested so much of her life into was already showing crack. On Valentine's Day of 2023, Kenisha revealed publicly that she had suffered a miscarriage. Her posts tried to wrap the heartbreak in resilience, framing the loss as something the two of them would overcome together. But behind those words lay something darker. Pregnancy, with all of its physical and emotional toll, placed additional strain on a relationship already buckling under pressure. For Moses, it became another source of frustration, another excuse for arguments and accusations. But Kenisha, ever determined to project strength, pressed forward. Later in 2023, she became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was complicated, her body reacting with symptoms of preeclampsia, a dangerous condition that can endanger both mother and child. The stress of managing a high-risk pregnancy while caring for her 2 older daughters collided with the chaos of living with Moses. For most women, this would have been a time for support, stability, and safety. For Kenisha, it was a period of heightened tension, where the man she had married became less a partner and more a source of fear. On June 23, 2024, Kenisha gave birth prematurely to her third daughter, baby Kamari, at just 30 weeks. The infant remained in the hospital for weeks, fragile, fighting to grow strong enough to leave. Kenisha visited, watched over her, and shared hopeful updates. On July 24, 2024, she finally carried Kamari home, believing that this new life might be a turning point. Yet even this moment of joy was overshadowed by the strain of her marriage. The presence of a newborn should have softened the home, but instead it seemed to expose its fault lines further. The sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the financial pressures, every stress compounded the volatility already boiling beneath the surface. Moses, incapable of empathy or patience, lashed out in ways that deepened Kenisha's isolation. Meanwhile, the carefully polished image she had once maintained began to crack. On social media, where she had proudly portrayed herself as the devoted wife of a redeemed man, hints of frustration and disillusionment slipped through. Posts that once spoke of loyalty began to reflect a woman who was tired, overwhelmed, and quietly questioning the story she had once defended so fiercely. The unraveling wasn't just happening in private arguments. It was happening in the very identity she had built around their relationship. Kenisha had told the world she believed in him. Now, admitting the truth, that he was not reformed, that he was dangerous, meant admitting she had been wrong. And that acknowledgement carried a weight of shame that abusers exploit with precision. Moses leaned on that shame, twisting her silence into complicity, keeping her tethered even as the violence escalated. For her daughters, the atmosphere in the home became one of unpredictability. They were old enough to notice the tension, young enough to be vulnerable to its impact. The stability Kenisha had once worked so hard to create for them was slipping. She had fought for her degree, worked long hours as a CNA, built her life as a homeowner and provider, all to ensure her children had a safe foundation. Yet with Moses inside those walls, the safety she had built was being eroded piece by piece. By the summer of 2024, the situation was approaching a breaking point. The miscarriage, the high-risk pregnancy, the premature birth, all had taken a toll not only on her body but also on her resolve. The dream of redemption through love was gone. What remained was survival, once again. And in quiet moments, Kenisha began to see the truth. She started making plans to leave, to protect her children, to reclaim the independence she had once lived so fully. To the outside world, these plans weren't visible, but those closest to her noticed a shift. The loyalty she had once defended so fiercely was beginning to falter. For Moses, this shift was catastrophic. Abusers thrive on control, and nothing threatens them more than the realization that their grip is slipping. For a man like Moses, whose entire identity revolved around dominance and manipulation, Kenisha's awakening was not just rejection, it was rebellion. And in his mind, rebellion had only one answer. The months following baby Kamari's birth were the most fragile and dangerous of all. Kenisha was a mother of three, exhausted, stretched thin, and trying to balance her public image with the reality of her private life. Moses was unstable, angry, and increasingly aware that the fantasy he had sold her was unraveling. The home on McCoy Drive, once meant to be her sanctuary, had become a place where every moment was tinged with fear. By July, the stage was set. The love story born in a prison cell, celebrated in a wedding behind bars, defended across social media and tested by pregnancies and loss, was no longer sustainable. The unraveling was complete. What had once been presented as loyalty had become entrapment. What had once been painted as devotion had revealed itself as control. And for Kenisha, the realization was clear. She could not live like this anymore. She had survived a miscarriage, survived preeclampsia, survived the premature birth of her daughter, but survival inside her marriage was no longer possible. To understand the tragedy that unfolded on August 4, 2024, we must look at the final 8 months after the December 2023 assault. We must see how posting his bond reshaped the dynamic, how Moses' control deepened, and how Kenisha's quiet awakening collided with his rage. It was in these final months that the fatal decision was made, not in paperwork or planning, but in the refusal to let her go. When Kenisha posted her husband's bond in December 2023, it seemed to outsiders like a baffling act of forgiveness. But inside the complicated psychology of an abusive relationship, her choice was not forgiveness. It was survival of a different kind. After years of manipulation, Kenisha had come to believe she bore responsibility for Moses' actions. By firing the gun that night, she felt she had crossed a line, that perhaps she had provoked his rage, that somehow she had caused the cycle to spin out of control. This is one of the cruelest truths of domestic violence, the way abusers convince their victims to carry the burden of guilt, even when the evidence of violence is undeniable. Moses's criminal record told a story of a man prone to violence. The charges from December told a story of escalating danger. But the story Kenisha told herself was different. She told herself she had gone too far. She told herself that if she had just handled the argument differently, if she had been calmer, if she had been more patient, things would not have escalated. And in that distorted mirror, posting his bond felt less like betrayal of her safety and more like repairing a wrong she believed she had committed. In the months that followed, that fatal decision redefined the relationship. The act of bailing him out reinforced Moses's control. To him, it was proof that no matter what he did, she would remain tethered to him. To her, it was a compromise with her own conscience, a way to reconcile the violence with the loyalty she had built her identity upon. But the dynamic was no longer equal. Moses had tasted violence inside their home and walked free. His confidence that he could do so again only grew. As 2024 unfolded, Kenisha began to change. The woman who once championed her love story publicly started to see the cracks widening in private. The miscarriage, the high-risk pregnancy, the premature birth, all had eroded her energy and tested her endurance. But it was not just her body that was tired. Her mind was awakening. She began to sense that her loyalty had not redeemed him, that her sacrifices had not softened him, and that her safety and her children's safety were slipping further from reach. She began thinking of divorce. Quietly, cautiously, she looked toward the possibility of separating her life from his. For years, her social media had been filled with declarations of loyalty. Now, her posts hinted at disillusionment, at the weight of responsibilities that seemed too heavy to carry. To those close to her, the message was clear. She was beginning to see Moses for who he really was. For an abuser, nothing is more dangerous than a partner preparing to leave. Control is the foundation of abuse, and when that control begins to fracture, the reaction can be explosive. Moses sensed it. He felt her pulling away. He watched her begin to reclaim her independence, to speak more openly about her struggles, to prioritize her children's safety over the image of loyalty she had once defended. The tension in the Neely home during those final weeks was palpable. Every argument carried the weight of finality. Every silence hinted at a breaking point. Moses's temper, already volatile, grew sharper. Kenisha's determination, already fragile, grew stronger. It was a collision waiting to happen. On August 4th, 2024, the collision came. That Sunday, Kenisha did what mothers often do. She put her children first. Whatever the argument was that day, whatever words were exchanged, she made one decision that would define her final act of love. She ensured her daughters were safe. Reports later confirmed that before the violence reached its climax, she had removed them from immediate danger. Her oldest daughters, 12-year-old Aaliyah and 5-year-old Jayla, were away from the house. Even infant Kamari, only 6 weeks old, was protected in another room. Kenisha, who had fought so hard to balance her devotion with her safety, chose in her last hours to put her children's lives above her own. Inside the home, the argument escalated. The same locked bedroom that had once been the site of a gunshot in December now became the site of the final act. Deputies were dispatched once again, called to the home on McCoy Drive. When they arrived, most of the rooms were eerily empty. Only one door was closed, locked from the inside. As they prepared to breach it, a gunshot rang out. When they forced their way in, the scene was one no officer forgets. Both Kenisha and Moses lay dead. The official determination would be clear: murder-suicide. Moses had shot Ket, ending her life before turning the gun on himself. In those final moments, the illusions that had once bound her, love, loyalty, redemption, were stripped away. What remained was the brutal truth. Moses was the man his record had always said he was, and Kenisha, despite her strength, had been caught in his cycle until the very end. The tragedy of August 4th is not just that Kenisha lost her life, it is that she lost it after every warning had already been sounded. The December 11th incident had revealed the danger. The charges had spelled it out. The system had briefly held him without bond. The red flags were not subtle. They were undeniable. And yet, through the twisting influence of manipulation, through the pressure of loyalty, through the silence imposed by shame, Kenisha remained. Her final day was not just the end of her life. It was the culmination of a pattern that stretched back years, a pattern that began with a message from prison, was cemented in a wedding behind bars, was tested by freedom, and was sealed by a single transaction at a bondsman's office. And as deputies closed the case file that August day, 3 daughters were left without their mother. But the story does not end with the locked bedroom on McCoy Drive. It continues in the voices of her children, in the grief of her community, in the silence left behind at her funeral. To understand the true weight of Kenisha's story, we must step into the aftermath, the funeral that drew her community together, the legacy she left for her daughters, and the lessons hidden in the red flags too many chose not to see. When deputies breached the locked bedroom on August 4, 2024, the story of Kenisha Miranda Harrison Neely reached its final, devastating chapter. There, in her own home on McCoy Drive, they found Kenisha, just 38 years old, fatally shot. Beside her was her husband, Sheldon Moses Neely, dead from a self-inflicted wound. It was a scene of silence, but the evidence spoke loudly. Murder-suicide. The home that once echoed with the voices of her daughters had become a crime scene. Only days earlier, she had been celebrating baby Kamari's release from the hospital. On that August day, instead of joy, the walls absorbed the grief of law enforcement, family members, and a community that had feared something like this was coming. Kenisha's 3 daughters were suddenly motherless. 12-year-old Aaliyah, on the cusp of adolescence, now had to shoulder the weight of a loss too heavy for her years. 5-year-old Jayla, full of the questions and wonder of childhood, was left trying to grasp why her mother would not return. And infant Kamari, only 6 weeks old, would never remember the warmth of her mother's embrace, only the stories others told her. News spread quickly through Hoffman, North Carolina. This was not a large city where tragedies could fade into the background noise of daily life. Here, neighbors had seen the fights, heard the shouting, worried in silence. Now, those private concerns crystallized into a public grief. On August 13, 2024, the town gathered at the Hoffman Recreational Complex for Kenisha's funeral. The service was filled with sorrow, but also with testimony to who she had been. She was remembered as a certified nursing assistant, a woman who cared for others with compassion and patience. She was remembered as a licensed bail bondsman, someone unafraid to step into hard spaces to build a better life for her family. She had a business administration degree, evidence of her ambition, and she was celebrated as a homeowner who had worked hard to carve out stability for her daughters. Above all, she was remembered as a mother whose devotion shaped every decision she made. After the service, she was laid to rest at the Jamison Harrison family cemetery. Even in mourning, those gathered could not ignore the bitter truth. This was not a natural loss. It was violence, and it was preventable. The red flags were not hidden. They were glaring. On December 11, 2023, deputies had already come to this very house. That night, Moses attacked Kenisha, locked her in a bedroom, and was shot when she fought back. The charges, kidnapping, assault on a female, interfering with emergency communications, made the danger clear. He was initially held without bond, as the system acknowledged the severity of what had occurred. But within days, Moses was free. Not because he had been proven safe, but because Kenisha herself had posted his $3,000 bond. That act, born from manipulation and guilt, returned him to the home where he had already proven capable of violence. For Moses, it reinforced his control. For Kenisha, it was the distorted outcome of years of psychological pressure. This is the haunting heart of her story. Her death did not arrive without warning. It came in spite of every warning. The system had glimpsed the danger. Her own actions that night, defending herself with a gun, had revealed how close she was to losing her life. And yet, the cycle continued. For domestic violence advocates, Kenisha's case highlights systemic cracks. Bond, meant as a safeguard, becomes meaningless when it allows violent offenders to return directly to their victims. Protective measures, even when in place, are often temporary and weakly enforced. And too often, victims who appear to defend or stay with their abusers are dismissed instead of supported, as though loyalty were a choice rather than a survival mechanism. Kenisha's life also dismantles stereotypes. She was not powerless. She was educated, employed, independent. She had achieved milestones many point to as safeguards: higher education, professional certifications, home ownership. Yet abuse is not about weakness. It is about control. Even the strongest, most capable person can be ensnared by manipulation. In the weeks after her death, the community tried to fill the void. A GoFundMe was launched to support her daughters, with donations pouring in from friends and strangers alike. Local organizations, including New Horizons Life and Family Services, invoked her name during domestic violence awareness events, planting her memory as part of a larger call for change. Across North Carolina, her story was added to the growing list of women lost to intimate partner violence in 2024, a tally that should shame every system that claims to protect victims. Her legacy lies not only in her daughters, who must now grow up without her, but in the lesson her story carries. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths: that abusers do not change because of loyalty, that violence does not fade because of patience, that second chances cannot be forced onto those who never sought them. Her death was not inevitable, it was preventable. The question is whether we will treat it as a statistic or as a warning. Will we continue to let bonds override safety? Will we continue to mistake manipulations for love? Will we continue to look away when the red flags are visible in plain sight? Thank you to my amazing subscribers. May your families stay safe wherever you are. If you're new here, subscribe and like this video because we reveal the warning signs that can keep you safe.